Demons of Chaos have the largest roster of any faction we've ever seen, with over 70 units available to build your armies with. This makes them into a very hard faction to build armies for, since it can be overwhelming seeing so many options laid out in front of you. Fortunately, this also makes them incredibly versatile, as you have something for any occasion. Let's quickly go over the pros and cons in battle. Having access to all the 4 Chaos rosters makes this one of the largest rosters in the history of the game, so you can try a variety of army builds with powerful units in nearly every category. You also have access to a large number of magical laws, so whether you like all-out offense or subtle buffs and debuffs, you'll find something for you. And of course, the Chaos rosters have a bunch of extremely powerful monsters for any occasion, and these are absolutely the highlights of the roster. As for the cons, having so many units can of course be overwhelming, leading to a lot of confusion and indecision when you're building your armies. Mixing units from different Chaos branches also means you won't be able to synergize them with your lords and skills very easily, so you will be leaving some value on the table no matter what you do. And you also don't have the most options for ranged units, so you'll likely be the one making the approach on enemies more often than not. Let's now get into the units, starting first with the lords. Our solitary legendary lord is the Demon Prince, which you can of course name whatever you want. Now, the Demon Prince can be customized with hundreds of different body parts to fit a large number of roles. I covered this deeper in the campaign video, but all you need to know is he can be built from pieces of the 5 Chaos branches, and each branch offers thematic effects that make him more powerful in combat. But 2 things that remain consistent no matter what you do: he's always flying and he always causes terror. You can also get access to certain spells depending on his body parts, allow him to pull from all kinds of laws, including the 3 laws of chaos. As a flying unit, the Demon Prince is extremely mobile, so can easily assault enemy back and front lines with ease wherever he is needed. No matter what build you go, he'll at least be passable in melee combat, especially versus clumps of enemies, with his large area of effect attacks. He can also get to be very tanky, but if you don't build into it, you can also end up pretty vulnerable to getting swamped. When you combine this with his large size, he can become an easy target for enemy ranged units to quickly focus down. If you build him with a lot of spells, then feel free to keep him either in the middle of combat or out of it altogether, so he can fly around to offer spell support where needed. The Heralds of Khorne are essentially very powerful bloodthirsters. They come with armor-piercing damage, anti-infantry attacks, and also flaming attacks. They have the choice of picking up 2 mounts, the Juggernauts, which are basically chaotic bull-like creatures that offer them a lot of speed and some damage, and the Shrine of Khorne, which is essentially a chaotic motorbike that grants buffs to the rider and surrounding units when in combat. And of course, since it's Khorne, they have no spells. Of course, as a Khorne unit, these lads are all about the head-on attack. They excel in clumps of enemy infantry and can even do this later into the game due to their armor-piercing and anti-infantry attacks. They also get powerful abilities for themselves and allies whilst in combat, with the Revel in Slaughter and Hellblade abilities. Once they get onto one of their mounts, they can either be a rapidly moving deadly charger with excellent sustained combat, or a badass chaos motorcycle that can do some pretty decent damage itself, whilst offering buffs to nearby units when in combat. Either way, keep him in the middle of the action, and you can't really go too far wrong. The Heralds of Nurgle are spellcasters, but they also deal armor-piercing and poison damage. They have access to 2 mounts, the Nurgle Palanquin, which is basically a chair carried by Nurglings, which gains you a ton of HP, as well as some armor and a little bit of speed. And the Rotfly, which isn't as much HP, but it is a ton of speed and some weapon damage, and you can of course fly. When recruiting these guys, you can choose from the Law of Nurgle or the Law of Death, and these lads aren't as serious fighters as the Khorne Heralds, but they can still pack a pretty meaty punch with armor-piercing attacks and poison damage, meaning anything they do attack will become an easier and weaker target. They also emit a cloud of flies when in combat that reduce the combat effectiveness of nearby enemies even further, meaning units close to this guy can go from hero to zero extremely quickly. They can pick spells from their chosen law, and both provide a number of powerful buffs as well as some pretty devastating damage if used in the right scenario. If you pick their Palanquin mounts, they become extremely tanky and destined for the front lines. If you go for the Rotfly, they're instead agile spellcasters that can charge around the map at high-ish speed to assist with magic where needed, while still doing a decent chunk of damage. Just don't let them get pinned down and surrounded, as they will go down very, very quickly. The Heralds of Slaanesh lie somewhere in the middle of spellcaster and high damage, since of course they can cast spells and bring armor-piercing damage to the table. They have 3 mounting options: the Steeds of Slaanesh, which are Slaaneshi horses that offer speed and charge bonus; the Seeker Chariots, which grant large increases to charge at the cost of being next to useless in sustained combat; and the Exalted Seeker Chariots, which grants them perfect vigor alongside the most devastating charges in the game. When recruiting them, you can choose from the Law of Slaanesh and the Law of Shadows, and these, as I said, are the most multi-class of the Heralds, as they are still powerful spellcasters whilst also doing very reasonable damage in melee combat. They are fast and attack viciously, especially on enemy flanks, so don't be afraid to send them around with a group to tear the enemy apart when they least expect it. Their spells from both laws are very powerful both in terms of damage and the buffs and debuffs they can place on the battlefield. Their Steeds of Slaanesh mounts are the fastest choice you have, so if you want to use them as pure spellcasters, then this is the one for you to zip them around where magic is most needed. They can still fight of course, but this allows them to be as mobile as possible. The other two chariots offer increasingly more devastating charges at the cost of not being quite as quick and a lot larger of a target. If you are comfortable with chariots, then the Exalted Seeker will devastate whatever you send it against, but if not, then probably easier to go with the Steed, just in terms of micro. The Heralds of Tzeentch are pure spellcasters, and they come with the Barrier of Tzeentch and Flaming Attacks. They have two mounting options, the Disc of Tzeentch, which allows them to fly and fire on the move with high speed and increased survivability, and the Burning Chariot, which offers these buffs with more HP and some actual weapon damage, allowing them to charge around and deal a ton of damage with spells and of course charging. And when recruiting them, you can choose from two Laws of Magic, the Law of Tzeentch and the Law of Metal. And finally, we reach the true spellcasters of the Heralds. These lads do not have the best melee stats, though they can use some ranged firepower to deal damage without getting totally involved in the front lines. I would say keep them from front lines battling against anything past the early game, and keep them on the backs and sides for ranged fire and magical support. They can utilise their powerful Law of Tzeentch and Metal to rain death and destruction upon their enemies, alongside a number of powerful augments and hexes. Of their two mounts, the Burning Chariot is the clear choice even for me. The disc offers very high speed for easy casting and of course flight for survivability, but the Chariot offers all of this on top of more HP, weapon damage, and more, allowing them to charge around in combat just as easily as they rule the skies and provide magic wherever needed. As mentioned in the campaign video, each of the 4 Heralds of Chaos can evolve into Exalted Demons upon reaching level 15. The Herald of Khorne evolves into the Exalted Bloodthirster of Khorne. This is a greater demon that is armoured, deals armour-piercing damage, causes terror, and has flaming and magical attacks. They of course have no mounts and no spells. These are quite similar to the Demon Prince, in the sense that they are large flying demons. These lads of course have a large focus on all-out offense with extremely high damage attacks that cut right through armour and can hit many units in an area of effect. They're also armoured, so can take a surprisingly large amount of punishments for something so large. They also have several powerful abilities that enhance their combat capabilities. Bloodthirst enhances their charge, Deathbringer enhances their damage, Bellow of Fury allows them to rain fire on enemies from a range, Burning Rage allows them to explode around them to create space and deal some damage, and Wrath of Khorne punishes enemy spellcasters with an explosion anytime they cast that will deal damage to the caster and anyone nearby. The Herald of Nurgle evolves into the Exalted Great Unclean One of Nurgle, and they remain spellcasters with whichever law you picked when you recruited the Herald. They also deal armour-piercing damage and of course cause terror. These are extremely tanky boys with a ton of health alongside decent armour and brilliant melee stats. They deal a big chunk of armour-piercing damage alongside poison and magical attacks. They can take a tremendous amount of punishment and deal a good amount, so don't be afraid to send them into the middle of combat. Of course, they maintain whatever Law of Magic they had before, so they can still provide the same spell support, albeit they are slightly less agile, so it won't be as simple to aid units on the other side of the map if needed. They also have a few powerful abilities. Blight Swarm allows them to spread a plague amongst enemy units that reduces their melee defense. They still have the same Cloud of Flies as Heralds, Fetid Stench reduces the leadership of nearby enemies, and Pestilent Decay deals damage to nearby enemies whilst in combat. The Heralds of Slaanesh evolve into the Exalted Keepers of Secrets of Slaanesh, and of course they are still spellcasters and deal armour-piercing and anti-large damage. This evolution takes away even more armour in exchange for extremely high speed and viciously high damage, turning them into destroyers of clumps of enemies or 1 versus 1 with other large single entities. Their high speed allows them to chase down a lot of cav units, and no foot troop can outrun them, making them very hard to get away from. They also keep the same Law of Magic as before, so you will still be able to provide that spell support where needed with their high speed. Of course, they also gain some abilities to assist them in combat. Seductive Glory reduces enemy defense nearby, Volley of Blows gradually increases damage and attack stats over 45 seconds, Glamour of Slaanesh reduces enemy melee stats nearby, Soul Siphon deals damage to nearby enemies, and Feasts on Fear replenishes HP per every enemy unit nearby with wavering or lower morale. And finally, the Herald of Tzeentch evolves into the Exalted Lord of Change. They are still primarily spellcasters and keep the barrier, and they of course cause terror. This is perhaps the biggest glow up of all, with buffs to every single stat. They are now fast flying monsters with powerful melee stats and a decent amount of tankiness when you combine 50 defense, 30 armor, 800 barrier, and 7800 HP. They are now capable of getting involved in the front lines and tearing most enemies to pieces, whether it's a clump of infantry or something larger. They of course still have their chosen law, so can pump out spells better than most lords and deal a lot of damage whilst doing it. And they have access to one ability, Prismatic Plurality, to reduce their cooldowns whenever they cast. They are still brilliant agile casters, now with added oomph in their fighting stats. Now we come to the heroes, starting with the Blood Reaper. These guys deal armor piercing and anti-infantry, and of course have flaming attacks, and they share the same 2 mounts of the Juggernaut and the Blood Throne with the Heralds of Khorne. You're about to hear this a lot, but these lads are literally the same units as Heralds, just not quite as strong. They are slightly weaker in every stat apart from armor, and the only difference is that they can't get hold of the same abilities. use them the exact same on the front lines, in the middle of some enemy infantry, and let them gorge themselves on blood, no matter what mount they choose. Next we have the Plague Ridden, and these are spellcasters that deal armor-piercing damage and have poison attacks. They have the same mounts of the Nurgling Palanquin and the Rotfly to the Herald of Nurgle, and they can of course choose from the Law of Nurgle or the Law of Death. Again, very similar to the Heralds, with them being worse in nearly every single stat, but speed, armor, charge bonus. Use them exactly the same as tanky boys on the front lines with powerful spell support, and pick them out of your choice once you can, and you're golden. The Illyricers are spellcasters that deal armor-piercing damage. They have the same 3 mount choices of the Steed of Slaanesh, Seeker Chariots, and Exalted Seeker Chariots as the Heralds of Slaanesh, and they can of course choose from the Law of Slaanesh or the Law of Shadows upon recruitment. Like Heralds, only worse in every single stat but armor and speed, and can't get on the same abilities. Use them the same of Heralds, so in the front lines or going around the back for a flank, whilst providing spell supports wherever needed and picking up a mount of your choice later on. And our final hero is the Iridescent Horror. They are spellcasters with the barrier and have flaming attacks. They have the same 2 choice of mounts of the Disc of Tzeentch and the Burning Chariot as the Heralds of Tzeentch, and can of course choose from the Law of Tzeentch or the Law of Metal upon recruitment. Everybody say it with me now. Basically the same as Heralds, but worse in most stats, and can't get all the same abilities. Use them exactly the same, on the sides and backs of combat to provide ranged and spell support until they get on a mount and can contribute more to actual combat. And now we get into the melee infantry. First up, we have the Nurglings. These are a tier 1 unit, they have poison attacks, and the Cloud of Flies aura that reduces enemy melee attack. These adorable little dudes are the fundamental swarm units of the roster. They have a ton of HP, but no armor, meaning once enemies are slinging out damage, they are going to fall off a very steep cliff in terms of effectiveness. In the early game, they will do surprisingly decent for you with good damage and passable melee stats, and of course poison attacks, which make any unit much better. Still, as soon as you can, I would back them up with some larger monsters to deal the damage, whilst these lads cause chaos and tank. Next we have the Blue Horrors of Tzeentch. These are a tier 1 unit, they have the Tzeentch barrier, special ranged weapons, flaming attacks, and a weak versus armor. They of course come with those ranged weapons which deal some decent damage in a short range before they engage in melee, and they actually have a surprising amount of damage, so definitely be sure to use these before you send them in. Once they do get in melee, they don't have the best stats with pretty low weapon damage and melee stats, barely surpassing 20. They do gain some added survivability with their meager armor and the Tzeentch barrier, but aside from that, they will likely fall pretty quickly to almost anything without help, so support them with monsters to keep them going. The Marauders of Slaanesh are a tier 1 unit, they are shielded, deal anti-infantry damage, and are a meat shield unit. These are pretty pathetic infantry that I really wouldn't recommend using. They have hardly any armor, very poor defense, and not a lot of damage. If you had the choice of literally any other infantry, I would say go with them, because these guys die super fast and do not do a lot of damage before they do. The only redeeming quality is that they do passable damage, but it's not enough as they die before they can make any use of it. I would totally avoid these lads if at all possible. However, they do come in 2 other variations. The Spears, which are again a tier 1 unit, are shielded and deal anti-large damage but are still a meat shield. These are a little step up with a lot more defense stats alongside Spears for charge resistance. I think there are still better options out there, but if you're wanting to run a Slaanesh army, then these lads are pretty passable at least in the very early game, as long as they have some support to do the damage for them. The other variation is Hell Scourgers, which are again a tier 1 unit. They are still shielded meat shields, but they're now defenders. These boys are the middle ground between Marauders and Spears. They have a high defense stat, so are decently resilient in combat, and they do a good amount of damage with a relatively high melee stat. I would say having 4 of these in the middle of 2 Spears would make for a pretty decent early game front line, but you'll want to replace them once the enemy get armor and more damage, as they will just not hold up. Next we have Chaos Warriors of Khorne, and these are a tier 2 unit. They are armored and shielded, and have Frenzy. These are some seriously tough infantry with high armor, a silver shield, and high melee defense. They are exceptional line holders and will take a very long time for the enemy to chip through until they get some AP damage on the go. The damage output is reasonable, but it's not particularly armor piercing, so once they're going against more armored targets, they will need some help. They're a pretty straightforward unit, just set and forget, and they'll hold the line just fine. They also come in 2 other variations. First the Halberds, which are again a tier 2 unit. They are armored, but lose the shield, deal armor piercing anti-large damage, and of course have Frenzy. This variant loses the axe and shield in exchange for a halberd, which grants them AP damage and a bonus versus large at the cost of some melee stats and of course the shield. This makes them into excellent large target assassins, especially if they can surround something. They're also decent versus armored infantry, but due to their low melee stats, it's not really worth using for this if you can help it. The other variation is the dual weapons, which are still a tier 2 unit. They're armored and deal anti-infantry damage and of course have Frenzy. Dual weapons grant them a large increase to weapon damage at the cost of some melee stats and the shield. Sadly, the damage they gain isn't overly armor piercing, so they are still best suited for taking on Legions of Chaff, where their anti-infantry damage will cut down anything without too much armor with ease. A line of 4 of these, flanked by some halberds, could keep the enemy busy for a very long time, giving you plenty of time to move units in to support them to wipe out the enemy. Next up we have the Plague Bearers of Nurgle. These are a tier 2 unit and have poison attacks. These lads have high HP, a bit of armor, and decent melee stats and damage along with poison. Sadly, they do not come with any armor piercing, so once they're going against anything with more armor than themselves, they're going to stop doing damage and require some support. Until that point though, they are a resilient wall of flesh to hold the enemy back. They just aren't ever going to be the main damage dealers in the army, and on top of this, most Nurgle units, including these guys, are kinda slow. They also come in another variation, the Exalted Plague Bearers of Nurgle. These are now a tier 3 unit and come with a special ranged weapon. The Exalted variant gains improvements to basically every single stat, as well as the Death's Head ranged weapon, which deals a good chunk of armor piercing damage in a couple of volleys, which makes for a nice initial burst of damage to whittle down enemy troops before you even make contact. Aside from that, they are still lacking a ton of armor piercing damage, so you'll want to keep them supported when you can, especially if they're up against any units with armor. The Forsaken of Nurgle are a tier 2 unit, and they are armored, have frenzy, and poison attacks. If your Plague Bearer is getting cut down by high weapon damage, then these guys might be more up your street. They come with very high armor and leadership, which makes them into one of the toughest line holders you can get your hands on for Nurgle. The damage output isn't too bad either, with a decent weapon damage, so anything without too much armor should go down fairly quickly. Anything better than that, then you'll want to bring in some support. Forsaken also come in a Tzeentch variant. These are armoured, have the barrier, and frenzy. The only differences between these and the Nurgle variants are, they gain a 400 HP barrier, magical attacks instead of poison, 40% spell resistance, and no longer cause fear. Other than that, use them exactly the same. Next up are the Bloodletters of Khorne. These are a tier 2 unit and deal armor piercing and anti-infantry damage. In true Khorne fashion, these are a real all-out offense type of unit. They have less HP and defense than Plague Bearers, but a lot more damage with armor piercing and anti-infantry damage. These are a great unit for the middle of your front lines to chunk through whatever infantry the enemy sends at you. If they don't kill whatever they're fighting fast enough, they will likely be taken out, so it's wise to pair them with some support so they can run down their targets as fast as possible to avoid taking any damage. They also come in a variant, the Exalted Bloodletters of Khorne, are a tier 3 unit. These deal armor piercing, anti-infantry, and have flaming attacks. The Exalted variants, as usual, are better in nearly every single stat, and now pick up flaming attacks, which reduce the effect of enemy healing. They also pick up the Hellblade ability, which empowers them as they get more kills. Aside from this, they want to be used pretty much the same as the regular Bloodletters, as they will perform the same job, just do it better, with more damage, and even a touch more survivability. The Demonettes of Slaanesh are a tier 2 unit, deal armor piercing damage, and are very fast. These are perhaps the squishiest of all the infantry at this tier, since they have basically no armor and not a lot of HP. However, they make up for this with high speed and very respectable damage and melee stats for when you unlock them. This makes them into great flanking units, especially once you remember that they have the devastating flanker trait, which nets them buffs when attacking any enemy in the back. And I would say to use them for exactly that. Get around the backs of enemy lines and charge them into the back to wipe out the enemy as quickly as possible. They are also excellent at taking out ranged units with their high speed, but it is really a waste of their damage. And of course, they come in another variation. The Exalted Demonettes of Slaanesh are a tier 3 unit and deal armor piercing damage, are very fast, and have enthralling attacks that reduce the melee attack stat of any enemy's hit. The Exalted variants, as usual, are better in nearly every single stat, so perform the same jobs, just do them a little bit better. They also pick up the Soul Sense ability, which gives them increased combat capabilities based on the number of wavering or lower enemies nearby. Now we come to our 2 and only missile infantry units, the Pink Horrors of Tzeentch. These are a tier 2 unit, have the Barrier of Tzeentch, are a decent melee combatant, and have flaming attacks. These are some of the very few ranged units in the demon lines, so they will get a lot more use than they probably should. They deal a decent amount of missile damage over a relatively short range, but they do have a steep firing arc, so can fire over the heads of your other units just fine. They are pretty hopeless in melee, so keeping them safe from being charged must be a high priority, otherwise all their ammo will go right down the drain. Keeping them behind or on the sides of the line should do fine, as long as you can choose targets carefully and avoid friendly fire where you can. And they come in another variation, the Exalted Pink Horrors of Tzeentch. These are a tier 3 units, have the barrier, are decent melee combatants, and flaming attacks. Like all other Exalted variants, these lads are basically better in every single stat, so will do more damage from a range, and are slightly less pathetic in melee, but only slightly. Still don't use them if you can help it. You should still try and keep them safe as much as possible, as the damage they pump out when firing is astronomically higher than that in melee. They also pick up the ability Arcane Mirth, which grants increased Winds of Magic recharge rates. Use them, pretty much the same, they just do more damage. We now come to the Cavalry and Chariots. First up we have the Hellstriders of Slaanesh, and these are a tier 3 unit. They deal anti-large damage, are very fast, and have poison attacks. These are your average early game cav units with a decent charge, high speed, and poor sustained melee stats. You want to use their speed to keep them on the move and out of reach of the enemy before charging into the back lines, or the backs of the front lines to break their spirit as fast as possible. Never leave these guys in combat, as they will fall extremely quickly. They also have the ability Soul Hunter, which grants them damage resistance, leadership, and charge bonus for each kill they make. They also come in another variation. Hell Scourgers, which are a tier 3 unit, deal anti-infantry damage, are very fast, and have poison attacks. These are more or less the same units, but they gain significant buffs to melee stats and weapon strength at the cost of losing the anti-large. This still doesn't mean they can hit the front lines and stay in it. It more means they will have a quicker and easier time taking out ranged units before looping back to cycle charge the front lines. Next up we have Seeker Chariots. These are a tier 3 units, deal armor piercing anti-infantry damage, and are still very fast. We all know chariots are basically the pinnacle of micromanagement. You must keep them on the move all times or they will fall in combat before you react. These lads are no different. They come with a devastating charge for such an early game unit, and of course are absolutely terrible in sustained melee, meaning they must be charged in and out of combat constantly to avoid damage. Luckily they are extremely fast, so getting around the enemy shouldn't be too much of a problem. If you're into micro, then go right ahead, but if you're more about a set it and forget it, perhaps look for something else. They also come in another variation, the Exalted Seeker Chariots. These are also a tier 3 unit, deal armor piercing anti-infantry, and are very fast. Of course, the Exalted version boosts stats for nearly everything, including a high upgrade to charge bonus and weapon strength. This does now come at the cost of being a single entity, but when you have 6 times the weapon strength, does it really matter? They also come with perfect vigor, so can charge around the map the entire battle and never tire of shredding enemies to pieces with their bladed wheels. Same advice as all chariots applies again. Keep them on the move, in and out of enemy lines, and never let them sit still in combat as they just melt. Next up we have the Seekers of Slaanesh. These are a tier 3 unit and deal armor piercing damage, are very fast, and have poison attacks. These are pretty much the direct upgrade to Hellstriders. With somehow even less armor and the same high speed, they are a very risky cav to use, with a very high ceiling for reward if you can master them. They have the same great charge and now come with armor piercing weapon damage and even high melee stats, meaning they will shred even the most resilient backlines units before coming back with a powerful charge. They should still not be left in sustained combats with anything that can put up even half a fight, as they simply do not have the resilience to survive. They also come in another variation, the Heart Seekers of Slaanesh. These are a tier 3 unit, deal armor piercing poison damage, and are very fast. Heart Seekers come with improvements to nearly every single stat, which pretty much makes them the coolest Seekers of Slaanesh. They can do anything that the original can do, but only better, with more damage, better melee stats, almost to the point of being able to take part in sustained melee fighting. But just because they can, doesn't mean they should, as they are still most effective when charging into the enemy backs and crushing them against your front lines. Next we have the Hellflayers. These are another tier 3 unit, deal armor piercing anti-infantry damage, and are extremely fast. These are more or less the direct upgrade to Seeker Chariots, and work as a decent rest stop between unlocking Seekers and Exalted Seekers. They gain increases to leadership, melee attack, and weapon strength, making them into even more powerful charges. You use them pretty much the same, so if you can get the hang of one, you will only be better with the other. Just keep them charging and moving, and don't let them get bogged down or you will regret it. Next we have the Gore Beast Chariot of Khorne. These are a tier 3 unit, are armoured, deal armor piercing anti-infantry damage, and have frenzy. Of course, being a Khorne unit means this lad is heavy and hits like a truck with no regard for defense. They come with extremely high armor and a decent health pool, so are at least somewhat sturdy in that regard. They are nowhere near as fast as Slaanesh chariots, but do have a massive charge bonus, along with armor piercing damage, which all spells disaster for your enemies at SummerSlam. Of course, they have horrible melee stats, so don't let them get caught in sustained combats, or they will die extremely quickly. The Chaos Knights of Tzeentch are a tier 3 unit, are armoured and shielded, have a barrier, and deal anti-infantry damage. These are your standard heavy sword cav. They come with very high survivability, with high HP, a barrier, high armor, and melee defense, meaning they can make for some great sustained battling cav. They still have a decent charge bonus, so once they make contact they'll get a nice damage bonus, but don't feel the need to charge them in and out if it's too much micro, as they'll still deal decent damage when sight in combat with high melee attack and respectable weapon strength. Not really a bad way to use them, but I would say it's most optimal to take out ranged units first before looping back to sandwich the enemy front lines. Next we have the Blood Crushers of Khorne. These are a tier 3 units, they are armoured, deal armor piercing and anti-infantry damage. These are another super tough cav unit, and of course have a strong focus on all-out offense with high armor piercing weapon damage and a strong charge bonus and magical attacks. Add on top of this a large mass and the Hellblade ability, and you have a unit that's going to bury itself deep in the enemy lines and stay there until either the enemy or themselves are all gone. They don't have the best defense in the world, so getting surrounded isn't the best idea, but charging into the backs of the enemy front lines should do nicely. The Doom Knights of Tzeentch are a tier 3 unit, are armoured and shielded, have a barrier, deal anti-infantry damage, and are of course a flying unit. These are pretty similar to the Chaos Knights of Tzeentch with just a few differences. For stars, they can fly, meaning they are incredibly fast and can get over and around enemies easier than any ground unit ever could. They also have a ton more weapon damage and a tastier charge bonus, meaning once they make contact, they are going to dish out a disgusting amount of punishment. Sadly, they do lose quite a lot of melee defense, HP, and a little armor, so aren't the toughest, so I would say keep them charging around rather than sitting them in combat, as they will not be able to survive if left alone. They can make for great flankers, as they can easily take out backlines of ease. Just be careful of anything with better melee stats than them. Burning Chariots of Tzeentch are another tier 3 unit, have the barrier, flaming and warp flame attacks, which imbue weakness to fire and reduced armor, and are of course a flying unit. These are a unit unlike any other. They are a flying unit that has one of the craziest missile strengths we've ever seen, with a staggering 1400, and it's armor piercing and fire. You want to choose key targets from the enemy lines to rain this onto and wipe them from the face of the earth. They only come with 9 ammo, so I would say turn fire at will off and choose what they're firing at all times. Once they are out of ammo, they have a very high weapon strength, but they don't have loads of health or armor or great melee stats, so I can't recommend letting them get involved in the front lines. The most they should be doing is some cycle charging, but just be very careful and get them out safely or you will regret it. And our final cav unit is the Skull Crushers of Khorne. These are of course the tier 3 units, are armoured and shielded, deal armour piercing and anti-infantry damage, and have frenzy. These are basically the direct upgrade to Blood Crushers, as they function pretty much the same but have some very important differences. For a start, they have even more armor and HP, so are actually extremely tanky. They also come with great melee stats, high weapon strength, and one massive charge. This all adds up to a unit that can charge into the backs of the enemy lines, crush them with impact, and take down any that remain in sustained melee combat. Now we come to by far the largest section, the monsters and beasts. First up we have the Chaos Warhounds. These are a tier 1 unit and are extremely fast, come with Vanguard deployment and Scaly Skin, which is another word for missile resist, and have weak versus armor. Now if you've ever used Warhounds in another Warhammer game, then you know how strong these lads can truly be in the early game. They are extremely fast, so have no problem getting around the backs of enemies into their vulnerable ranged units. If you stick them 2-on-1 against enemy ranged, they will shred them in seconds, and once they start retreating, it is game over. Nothing takes out retreating units quite as effectively as Warhounds. However, you should never send them into the front lines, as they simply cannot survive to do meaningful damage. Take out all the ranged and then wait for anything retreating. Chaos Furies are a tier 2 unit, and they're very fast and have Vanguard deployments, and are of course flying. These are your early game flying monsters with high speed and decent damage, but not much in the way of defense. Similar to Chaos Warhounds, you want to send them into the enemy range and take them out before they can harm your army. Never send them alone against anything that can fight back in melee, as they simply cannot stand up for themselves with their low armor and very low defense. The best scenario is probably sending these in first to bring the enemy close to breaking and finish them off with Warhounds before moving on to the next unit. Next up we have Plague Toads of Nurgle, and these are a tier 1 unit. They deal anti-infantry and poison attacks, and these are the first unit you can send into the front lines for a damage boost whilst keeping them safe. They have a decent tankiness alongside respectable damage and speed. This makes them into a great addition for the front lines, as they can deal a good amount of damage to infantry at once with their high model count and splash damage. They could also be used for flanking, but their speed isn't as high as other units, so it's probably best to leave it to them and keep these boys in the front lines. They also have another variation, the Puck's Riders of Nurgle. These are a tier 2 unit and deal anti-infantry and poison damage. Adding the riders brings improvements to most stats, making them tougher and more damaging, meaning they can hit harder and are harder for the enemy to get rid of. Other than the stat differences, you can treat them pretty much the same as the base toads. Get them in the front lines or around the back and let them get stuck in. Next up we have the Fleshhounds of Khorne. These are a tier 2 unit, are extremely fast and come with Vanguard deployment. They are basically bigger and stronger versions of the Warhounds at the cost of being a much smaller model count. They keep the extremely high speed, so are excellent at getting around into the enemy backlines, and are even better at tearing them to pieces with their much improved weapon damage, charge bonus, and melee stats. They still aren't frontlines units, but they will take out any ranged infantry you throw them at, and while they may not be as efficient at cleaning up once they're on the run, they still do a fantastic job. Screamers of Tzeentch are a tier 2 unit, come with the barrier, anti-large damage, and are of course flying. These seem like the logical upgrade to Chaos Furies with their much improved weapon damage, but aside from that, they are somehow the same or worse in almost every single stat. On top of this, they are shaped like kites, so are massive tags for enemy range, meaning if you don't shut down enemy missiles, they are going to feel the burn. They are also not even close to tough, so anything sent their way, they are going to feel it. However, if you can get them alive into the enemy backlines, they will do an excellent job taking out ranged backlines and some weak cav, but never send them into the front lines. Their melee stats mean they will crumple like a napkin if put against anything that's putting up a decent fight. The Beasts of Nurgle are a tier 2 unit. They deal armor piercing and poison damage and come with regeneration. Now we have some proper frontlines monsters. These gross guys are excellent at getting into your own and the enemy front lines and dealing a great chunk of damage whilst they're there. They have great health and a good bit of armor alongside decent melee stats to take a lot of damage before they go down. They also have a high weapon damage, so sling out tons of damage versus whatever you send them against. Put them into the middle of your front lines to ensure they stay alive and get them stuck into their enemy. Rotflies are another tier 2 unit and come with armor piercing damage. These are a much smaller unit size flying beasts unit. These lads have a lot more HP than Screamers, along with double the armor, meaning they can stand up to a light breeze if it comes to knocking. They are still extremely fast and deal great damage with a very high weapon strength and halfway decent melee stats. Use them pretty much the same as other flying beasts. Get into the enemy backlines and work together with some hounds to wipe any enemy ranged units off the face of the earth. Do not let them get pinned down in combat with anything halfway decent in melee, as they will still fall very quickly. They also come in another variation, the Plague Drones of Nurgle. These are a tier 3 unit and come with armor piercing and poison attacks. Adding riders brought improvements to most stats similar to the Plague Toads. They are essentially the same units, but now deal and can take more damage. Use them the exact same as before, and they'll perform the same job, just a little bit better. Now come to the spawns, starting with the Spawn of Khorne. These are a tier 3 unit and come with Unbreakable and Rampage. If you've played Warhammer 2, then these lads aren't really anything new to you. They still look mostly the same and perform that way too. They are hulking masses with a ton of HP, hardly any armor, and strong weapon strength without a ton of HP. Stick them in the middle of your front lines and they will fight until either they or the enemy is gone with their unbreakable leadership. Each of the 4 Chaos branches has their own. The Khorne variant have a slightly better attack and weapon strength as well as Rampage. The Nurgle ones have poison attacks and the Cloud of Flies passive, Slaanesh ones have the devastating flanker ability and high melee defense, and the Tzeentch ones have the barrier, high defense and armor sundering attacks. All 4 can be used exactly the same, so you can mix and match or pick your favourite. Next up we have the Fiends of Slaanesh. These are a tier 3 units and deal armor piercing damage. They are extremely fast and come with a soporific musk, which just reduces enemy melee stats. These guys are a truly unique monster unlike anything we've ever talked about. They're extremely fast and hit incredibly hard with very high weapon strength and pretty high melee stats for a monster. This makes them into great flanking monsters that get around the backs of the enemy lines and dismantle their ranged troops in moments, or hard focus on the backs of the front lines to shatter their spirits. You can just send them in your front lines, but where's the fun in that? Besides, this way you get to make the most of that devastating flanker trait. The Minotaurs of Khorne are another tier 3 unit. They are armoured, deal armour piercing and anti-infantry damage. These are very similar to the Minotaurs from the Beastmen in Warhammer 2. They are decently fast and hit like an absolute truck, with a chunky bit of charge bonus and a high weapon strength. These lads belong on the front lines to make the most of the armour piercing and anti-infantry damage. They may not have the best defense in the world, but they do have a nice bit of HP and armour, so will survive just fine and kick a lot of ass while they do. They also come with another variation, the Great Weapons. These are of course a tier 3 unit, are armoured, deal armour piercing and anti-large damage. They are pretty much the same as the base Minotaurs, but they have 6 more charge bonus and trade the anti-infantry for anti-large. This makes them into large target assassins, as they can chunk through large entities like they are nothing. Taking a combination of the two would work best for having something for any occasion. Next up we have the Lords of Change. These are a tier 3 unit and are spellcasters that come with the barrier and cause terror. These are basically Lord units, the only thing they are missing is the skill tree. They are large single entities with high HP but low armor, meaning they can take a beating, but it's not wise to send them too deep into the front lines. They can fly, which makes them extremely fast, meaning they can be anywhere you need them at the drop of a hat. They also have very high melee stats and great weapon damage, meaning whatever you do send them against, they'll do some good damage whilst they are there. They also come with 2 spells of the pink and blue fire of Tzeentch, so provide a little magical support alongside their powerful melee fighting. I would say keep them on the move to do a little damage here and there, while sprinkling in spells wherever needed. Next we have the Soul Grinders of Khorne. These are another tier 3 units and come with precursory missile weapons. They are armoured, deal armour piercing damage, can fire in the move, and have flaming magical melee attacks. These are endgame single entities of destruction, and they can really do it all. They come with powerful ranged weaponry, with a decent range and a ton of ammo to rain death on your enemies from the sides. They're also masters of melee combat with a ton of HP and armour, alongside brilliant melee stats and weapon strength. Not really a bad way to use these guys, to be honest. Either set them up to deal devastating ranged damage, or send them in to tear up the enemy lines close and personal. Either way, they'll do great for you. Just to warn you, these guys do not have a ranged firing option when you right click, but if you leave them on fire at will, they will fire at whatever they see. And each branch of Chaos also has one of these. The Slaanesh version has no ranged, but has increased weapon damage, a bonus versus large, and a soporific musk. And the other 2 are in the missile category, so we'll come back to them shortly. Next we have the Great Unclean one. These are a tier 3 unit, and deal armor piercing, poison, and magical damage, and of course cause terror. Similar to the Lord of Change and the other greater demons, this lad is essentially the Exalted Lord, but with no skill tree and some slightly worse stats. They're still massive tanks with a ton of HP, as well as a boatload of armor piercing damage and great melee stats, making them into a fat lump of nearly unkillable disease that can deal a massive amount of damage over the course of a battle. They also gain 2 bound spells of Stream of Corruption and Miasma of Pestilence, so can provide magical support to units nearby. Send these lads deep into the enemy lines to soak some damage and dish out a ton too. The Keepers of Secrets are a tier 3 unit. They are spellcasters, shielded, deal armor piercing and magical damage. Again, basically a Lord with worse stats and no skill tree. They are still fast as hell and deal devastating damage to whatever they get their hands on, so feel free to send them all over the map to take out whatever needs taken out. They also bring 2 bound spells, Lash of Slaanesh and Acquiescence, so can provide some spell support wherever they are. Not much to say here really, since they are just like weakened Lords. And finally, we come to the Bloodthirster. This is a tier 3 unit, deals armor piercing, anti-large damage, causes terror, and has flaming attacks. And we have another lad that's basically a Lord with worse stats. They are still incredible warriors, with outstanding damage and melee stats, all packaged into a flying demon of staggering size. Send them wherever you want, and they will rip and tear whatever you put in front of them at a rate that few units can match. They're a pretty straightforward unit, as seems to be the Khorne way. Oh, and it goes without saying, but for this guy and all the large monsters, keep them safe, as ranged units can quickly burst them down, even the weakest ranged units in the game in enough numbers. We now come to the missile monsters and beasts. First up we have the Flamers of Tzeentch. These are a tier 3 unit, come with the Barrier of Tzeentch, armor piercing, warp flame and flaming attacks. These lads are pretty much entirely reliant on their ranged weapons since their melee stats and survivability are just not it. They have hardly any armor, low HP, and horrible defense. Fortunately, the range damage more than makes up for this, with incredible armor-piercing warp flame damage, raining on enemies and decimating anything they come into contact with. They don't have a lot of ammo, so choose your targets carefully and make them count to make the most of it, as once they run out, they will be pretty useless. Don't be fooled by the high weapon strength, they don't belong anywhere near melee combat if at all possible. We also have the Exalted Flames of Siege. These are a tier 3 unit, come with the Barrier of Siege, warp flame, armor piercing and flaming attacks. From 12 entities to 1, and somehow the missile strength has risen to 1400. Gotta love chaos. Again, these lads are entirely focused on the range damage with little care for anything else. You want to set them up and fire them sparingly, ensuring you have a clean shot at your intended target to make the most of their astronomical ranged power and low ammo. Once they run out, I would still keep them away from melee unless you have absolutely no choice, as they have no defense and will melt like an ice cube in a sauna. Next we have the Plague Drones of Nurgle with the Death's Heads. These are a tier 3 unit, deal armor piercing and poison damage, and have a special ranged weapon. These boys are pretty much the same as the regular Drones of Nurgle we talked about earlier, but they now have riders and ranged weapons. They deal a good bit of armor piercing damage over a short range, but since they are flying, they should have no problem getting into position so long as the enemy has no flyers. Just remember to keep an eye out for enemy ranged units, as there is no easier target than stationary flyers. Once they run out of ammo, feel free to send them in just like you would the base unit, since they do have identical melee stats. There is really no reason not to upgrade. And finally we come to the Soul Grinders of Nurgle and Siege. The Nurgle ones have reduced weapon strength and melee stats, but gain a ton of armor-piercing missile damage from a massive range. This makes them into a multi-class artillery piece that can snipe at the enemy from across the map, as well as get deep into the front lines and tear them to pieces up close and personal. The Siege variant of course gets the barrier, and these lads have less ammo and range than Nurgle Grinders, but have a ton more damage per shot, alongside bonus versus large, making them great for sniping single entities in the enemy lines. And our final category is Artillery and War Machines. First we have the Blood Shrine of Khorne. This is a tier 3 unit, is armoured, deals armour piercing, anti-infantry and flaming damage. These are the mounts that the Heralds and Blood Reapers can get on. They are essentially Harley Davidsons, decorated to look ornate. These are chariot units, so of course come with a nice hefty charge bonus, and their best use is of course driving in and out of the enemy lines to rack up kills where they can. If they get stuck in the middle of the enemies, they will not last long despite what their armor stat would have you believe. They have extremely low melee defense and a large hitbox, meaning they will be hit many times per second and be dismantled very quickly. We also have the Gore Feast ability, which allows them to replenish HP whenever in combat. And our final unit is the Skull Cannon. This is a tier 3 unit, it is armoured, deals armor piercing, anti-infantry and flaming attacks. This is the one and only artillery piece of the Chaos Forces for now, and I couldn't be more in love. It has a huge range and massive armor-piercing damage that decimates whatever it makes contact with. It does, however, have a limited ammo capacity, but worry not, it also functions as a chariot, so if you run out, you simply can drive through some enemies and rack up even more kills. On top of this, the Gore and Skull Feast abilities allow it to replenish HP and ammo whenever it is in melee combat, so if you fire all your ammo, mow down some enemies and then dip out, you can do it all over again. Now we'll go through some army compositions for each stage of the game. Now in Warhammer 3, every unit has a tier from 1 to 3. I'm going to be using these tiers to make you armies for the early, mid and late game, so that you are set for every single step of your campaign. Also, it's worth noting that each of the 4 Chaos Lords you can recruit only have skills to improve units from their realm, so if you're looking to make the most of that, you should stick to their own units. I'll cover the comps for the 4 Chaos factions when I make their guides. Now you can also only unlock certain units upon dedicating yourself to one of the 4 Chaos Gods. If you choose Undivided, then you can get them all, so for the sake of making these comps, I'm going to assume that that's what you've gone with. So for tier 1, we are going to be leading our armies with the Heralds of Nurgle. Now you can choose from any of the Heralds since they are all powerful in their own way, so it really does come down to personal preference, and Nurgle is of course my favourite god, so I'm going to go with this lad today. They do passable frontlines damage, as well as eventually getting some powerful spells online to support the enemy in every way they can, and of course I'm going for the Lore of Nurgle, since it's strong and also pretty cool. For the front line, we're going to go with 2 Marauder Spears for some flank protection and anti-large damage, and 4 Marauder Hell Scourges for some meat in the front lines. We're going to go with 5 Blue Horrors for a spot of ranged firepower and eventually flanking infantry, 4 Plague Toads of Nurgle to get embedded in the melee lines, and 4 Chaos Warhounds to get around the backs of enemies and take out ranged units. This composition has as sturdy a front line as you can get right now, with a Lord that can dive in and get involved, whilst also utilising magic for double the value. The Blue Horrors provide that small amount of ranged firepower that will have a major impact versus early game units. The Toads will provide some front lines damage that the melee lines would otherwise be lacking, and nothing takes out early ranged units, quite like Warhounds. Tier 2, still got that Herald of Nurgle, who should be doing good work in the front lines, and have a few more spells unlocked by now. They should be getting close to level 15, so you can make the choice to evolve them, or keep them as they are when that time arrives. We're going to embed a Blood Reaper into our armies for some front lines presence with powerful melee damage and eventually mounts that provide buffs to those around them and increase the capabilities of my front lines even further. For the front lines, we're going to go with 2 Halberd Chaos Warriors, replacing those Marauder Spears with a ton more armor, as well as brilliant anti-large damage and charge bonus to protect those flanks. You're going to go with 4 Bloodletters to bring early armor-piercing damage to your front lines, and they will walk over most early infantry until they start slinging enough damage back. We're going to go with 4 Pink Horrors of Siege, which will provide ranged firepower and provide any extra damage the front lines will need, especially if you can get them in angle. Going to go with 4 Fleshhounds, as these are an obvious upgrade from Warhounds, as they do the same job, just a little bit better, and can stand up to the minigame ranged units you might come across. And closing us out, we're going to go with 4 Rotflies, as they are bringing some air superiority to get to those hard to reach enemy ranged units and harass the back lines even more than the Hounds already are. This comp has a sturdy front line with high damage output, meaning you can keep the enemy still for a very long time and take out a lot of them whilst you're doing so. The ranged units allow you to rain even more pain on the front lines, or focus down any single entities you come across that would otherwise cause your melee troops some trouble. And the monsters handle the backlines of ease and ensure they cannot get many shots off before they are taken out, or at the very least kept busy. Yes, it would be nice to have some beasts in the front lines, but they can manage without it, and we are about to get extremely monster heavy, so I would not worry. And for tier 3, our Herald of Nurgle should have evolved into an Exalted Great Unclean One of Nurgle. I would always say to go for the Exalted upgrades for all the lords, as it only makes them stronger with no major downsides, aside from maybe putting on little weight. This guy is now as tanky as a, well, tank, and slings out a decent amount of damage. His spells also ensure that enemies stay stinky and bleeding all the way to the victory screen. Our Blood Reaper should be on his Blood Shrine mount by now, and he'll be able to charge around and deal a ton of damage whilst he buffs your troops just by being there. For our front lines, we're going to go with 4 Exalted Plague Bearers. These are an extremely tanky front line that also does some decent damage, but I'm mainly taking them to tank damage and keep the enemy still. For ranged, we're going to go with 2 Flamers and 2 Burning Chariots of Siege. I decided to go with 2 of each of these guys, so you have something for taking on general infantry and something for very specific and high HP targets. The regular flamers can really be used anywhere, but make sure you hold back the chariots for the most key of all targets. I'm going to go with 2 Skull Crushers of Khorne, picking up some cav presence to run havoc on the backlines and give the army some much needed mobility, whilst not adding a ton of micro. These are super tough and deal a bunch of damage, so send them around and deep into the enemy backlines, they should do just fine. Going to go with 2 Keepers of Secrets. These are probably the best all-around Greater Demon units, as they have strong spells whilst also being quick and powerful melee fighters. Get them around the backs of the front lines to get some flanks off and use their spells for some added oomph. 2 Minotaurs with great weapons will be your large target assassins with great anti-large weapon damage and good speed. They can focus down giant targets with ease and hit very hard into infantry if they need to. 2 Soul Grinders of Tzeentch, and these will be for sniping those large targets from afar, and of course can get involved in the front lines if needed. And finally, 2 Skull Cannons, because you gotta have some chunky artillery to blow apart the enemy infantry from across the map, and of course they basically have unlimited ammo, so they're a super strong pick. Now, I know this army has 10 different kinds of units, and it seems like a lot of micro, and you're probably right, but it has units to take on any kind of foe, and it can adapt to different situations. You have units fast enough to counter ranged focus, strong enough melee warriors for front lines focus, anti-large for monster focus. With this many units in your roster, you can bring something for any occasion, and I believe this army will perform excellently in your endgame as the Demons of Chaos. And that finally concludes this truly epic feature-length film of a video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. If you did, then please do be sure to leave a like, it really does help out so much. Leave any questions you have in the comments below and I'd be more than happy to answer them. If you want to see more videos like this, showing you how to play every other faction in Warhammer 3, then be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a single video. On Friday, we begin the Cathay guides, so be very excited for that, as they are one truly explosive faction. If you'd like to support the channel, then you can become a member here on YouTube, a subscriber on Twitch, or a patron on Patreon. Doing so gets you shoutouts on the end screen, like Dominic Shamas and of course Henry Tucker for his support at the Unclean Ones tier. One more time, thank each and every one of you so very much for watching, and for now, I've been Colonel Damneders, and I will see you next turn.